Hello, this is the last of the stories I'll be recording for this year's Halloween, and as tonight is the feast of Samhain, the old Gaelic festival in which we honour the dead within paganism, I'm recording a story that's a little bit more in keeping with the spirit of the religious season rather than just the Hollywood type stories I've been recording previously. This is the story of the Seskatchewan Six. Hamish had moved from Aberdeen up to Nova Scotia across the great oceans with his parents as a young lad. And they'd settled and enjoyed their new territory, his parents taking to their life of shopkeeping as grocers. And Hamish, well, he enjoyed it, but even as a young lad he'd always been something of a loner, always preferring to spend his time off in the woods rather than playing with other children, rather than sitting in the schoolroom listening to all of the dronings of the teacher. And as he grew older and he came to adulthood, he expressed no great interest in following his parents into the shopkeeping business, and they for their part could quite understand that so taciturn a young man wouldn't be ideally suited to charming and smarming their way round incoming customers. And so he'd expressed an interest in trapping. Not so much because he particularly enjoyed hunting, but because it gave him all of the opportunity to be out by himself, traversing the great woods for months at a time, before he'd need to come back into civilization to sell on the furs and sometimes the meat and other bits and pieces that he'd found on his journeys through the woods. And on those rare visits to civilization, he would exchange news with the neighbours, such as they were, who remembered him, admittedly a little dimly, trade and buy a few goods for himself, and then within a week or two of visiting his relatives, his parents, his younger brothers and sisters, he'd be off again, getting the itch to travel. And back to the woods he went. In due time, his parents died, they passed over, and they left an inheritance. Some of it went to the younger brothers and sisters, but a little went to Hamish himself. And straight in the bank it went, for he had no great interest in money beyond his absolute bare minimum needs. And people assumed he would eventually just die in the woods somewhere as an old crotchety man, getting stranger and stranger and stranger. And he probably would have done. Except in midlife, Hamish suddenly, on one of his trips into town to trade, announced to his bewildered neighbours that he was planning on settling down and getting married. Not settling down, you understand, in the town, but in a log cabin, far, far out into the woods, miles and miles from the town, where they could be quiet, they could be content. And the woman he was settling down with was not one of the townswomen, but a woman of the Cree, the native tribe of the region. He had met her, Nuna, and fallen in love with her. She was past the first blush of youth. She'd been married once to a man of her own tribe. She'd had 2 children, but neither her husband nor the children had survived, passing away to illness and warfare. Her own family were somewhat bemused by her choice of husband, and his neighbours and his younger siblings were completely bewildered by his choice of wife. But, as he said to them, he had fallen in love with her the very first time he'd met her, and she, in the passage of time, had come to love him. And they wanted to live in the woods, to do a little bit of very basic farming and foraging, and he to focus still on his trapping. And as well as buying a few household goods for his wife to help run the place, he also decided to buy some sled dogs, a breeding pair, so that they'd have help in the winter and the dogs could help as well during the summer with hunting and so on. And that's how they lived for many a happy long year. And then suddenly one summer, Nuna told him that, unexpectedly, because she thought that such things in her life were long past, but quite unexpectedly she had become pregnant. And that not only was their house filled with the pitter-patter of 4 paws, for the breeding pair of dogs had bred and added to the sled pack, but within a few months would be resounding to the pitter-pat of 2 feet. And this came as a shock to Hamish, and, as you may imagine, a shock to his wife, but a happy shock nonetheless. And they prepared. He went out and assiduously hunted more and more, so they would have plenty of furs to not only keep them warm, but to sell in town and trade for all of the things he would need to help raise a new family. And they'd planned well ahead. Except as the summer rolled on, and Nuna grew heavier and heavier and heavier, they saw signs that the winter was going to be particularly harsh. They were both people of the land. They'd learnt to read the signs given by trees and by birds and by the sky of forthcoming weather patterns. And they thought they would probably be well advised to journey into the town when her time came. Maybe not to consult the doctors, because Hamish had no great faith in doctors, but there were midwives, and she was quite willing to consult the midwives in the town, although, truth be told, she would have preferred the midwives of her own people. But her husband was the one to set the agenda on these things. The time rolled on. But as good as they were at reading the signs of the land, the winter, when it came far more quickly than either of them had anticipated. The weathers grew heavier and heavier and heavier, and the more heavy the snows came, the more the child in Nuna's womb began to weigh heavily on her body. It began to give her aches and pains, and she thought at first it was because this was a late child and her body was past the full vital flush of youth when such things are best suited to happen. But she began to worry, and her husband was away, busy hunting. He had no conception as to the trials and tribulations that she was going through, never having had children of his own previously. Unlike her first husband, he wasn't prepared for such things. And she waited and she waited and she waited for him to come back. And he was a full week longer in returning with the dogs than he had said he would be. And he explained of all of the trials and tribulations he'd had on their hunting trip, of how things had gone from bad to worse. They'd had so much difficulty finding animals to hunt down and successfully capturing them, even with the pack of 6 dogs to assist him in getting the game creatures that they were after. And the terrible weather hadn't helped at all. They'd got lost in the woods 3 times. Lost! He who knew these woods like the back of his hands, and the dogs who could follow scents as easily as anything, had nonetheless become lost 3 times in the woods. And Nuna said this was not a good omen, for she herself had, on her foraging trips into the local woods, glimpsed signs that made her worried and concerned. She had, she told her husband on one occasion, seen in the far distance what she felt sure was the passing shadow of a Wendigo. And at first her husband laughed this off, because such things surely do not exist, these monsters of the Cree myths and legends. But she was absolutely straight-faced. She was convinced that Wendigo and all of the other creatures told of in myth and legend did indeed exist, and not only did exist, but she had seen its passing shadow. And where once the Wendigo passes, it may come again and again. And the thing with Wendigos is that once they get a scent for human flesh, their appetite knows no bounds and will not relinquish until either they die or the human does. Even as they sat there talking late into the night, sharing each other's company, enjoying a hot stew, considering what to do in the coming days, the wind began to howl and howl and howl outside their log cabin. The snows began to pile up higher and higher and higher. The dogs, all 6 of them, became more and more restless, worried and distressed by whatever it was that they could smell and scent outside the cabin. And at first Hamish was all for grabbing his gun and going out and hunting it down. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was a wolf. It was something that was distressing the dogs. But Nuna said, "Please, husband, please, don't go. Those winds, they're so terrible. You can hear them howling. The snow is piling up. We can see it through the window. If you go outside, you might become disoriented. Whatever hungry creatures are out there that are worrying The dogs, if they are indeed creatures of the normal sort, might turn upon you. Let's wait till morning before we leave and go outside. And they waited and waited, a sleepless night. And whatever was outside, maybe the child that was in Nuna's womb could sense it, grew distressed. For it turned and tilted in her womb, and she became more and more pained and discomforted and felt that her time was surely getting near. The waters weren't breaking, but she was in a bad way. Things were not going well with the pregnancy, and it got worse and worse as the night went on, and the winds howled and howled and howled outside. And occasionally there were sounds that were not wind, were not the creaking and groaning of trees, that were not the howling of wolves or the snuffling of bears, but something stranger, more worrying, more feral than any of that. Noises from some beast that Hamish could not identify, that Nuna, if she could identify, was unwilling to identify. And he became more and more worried and said, at first light, regardless of the weather, we're setting up the sled. We'll put the dogs on the sled and you, my wife, on the back, and we'll take as what goods we can take with us, and we'll head either to the Cree settlement or to town, depending on which direction is the safest to go in, as to how the snows have fallen. And his wife, who by this time was really in quite considerable pain and distress with her pregnancy, agreed that that is exactly what they should do. And as promised, at the first light of dawn, as it stretched its chilly fingers across the land, Hamish crept out of the cabin, gun at the ready, but the dogs were calm. Whatever had been distressing them in the night was not there now. They were not reacting, and he felt reassured. The snows had stopped falling, for a while at least. The wind had died down and stopped howling, but they were deep, deep snows, blocking their routes left and right, east and west and south. It was not an easy passage, just getting outside the cabin and getting to where the sled was tied up, to scrape the snows off the sled and drag it bodily out of its icy tomb, to pack bits onto the back of that sled, to get the dogs harnessed up to the sled. It was no mean feat given the depths of the snow. And whilst he was doing all of this, although he didn't want to say anything to his wife, for she was in enough pain and distress as it was, he saw tracks in the snow. Tracks the like of which he had never seen before. They were of no creature he could identify, and of such a size that whatever made them was large, much larger than a bear, much larger than any creature in those woods had a right to be. And he thought of all of the warnings that his wife had given him the night before, of the tales she had told. And he was worried. He wanted to get that sled rigged up and ready to go as soon as he humanly could, but it took a good couple of hours. Finally, the sled was ready, and he was able to get Nuna out, wrapped up in fur after fur after fur and blankets, until she was waddling like a little penguin out into the snows, and he bundled her onto the back of the sled and got onto the front of the sled himself so he could steer, and took the only safe route out, which was the route down towards the town, the white settlement rather than the Cree settlement, because the way to the Cree settlement was just too heavily snowed in to be passable. The first mile they made reasonably well, and he thought, as she thought, restless in the back of the sled, that this journey would be unpleasant but manageable. It should take them no more than about 4 hours travelling over the snow to get to the settlement, when they heard the howling. Something miles off in the distance had thrown back its head and shrieked. It was a howl unlike anything that Hamish had heard before in all of his many decades traversing the great forests. He had heard wolves howl, he had heard bears roar, he had heard deer belling to each other, he had heard all manner of creatures calling and crying, and never once had anything made a noise like this, a noise that bespoke of such hunger. He G'd up the horses, the dogs, to ride, to pull rather a little quicker, and the sled took off, going down the slopes faster and faster. The dogs themselves seemed to respond when the creature howled again, and even without him egging them on, they went faster still and faster. And as they sped through the snows, that howling every few minutes seemed to get closer and closer. And Nuna, restless and in pain on the back of the sled, begged her husband to keep going, not to stop, not to rest, but to get as far away, as fast away as they possibly could, to ride and to ride and to ride. And then, perhaps a quarter mile, maybe less than that, distance, they heard a terrible cracking, the kind of cracking you normally only hear in the spring thaw when ice is beginning to break. And Hamish hoped that this was the cracking of tree branches breaking under the weight of snow, maybe, or of something which he dreaded, breaking its way between the trees. And the howling came again. They turned this way and that, taking as the dogs as fast as the dogs were capable of pulling them through the snows, the deep, almost impassable snows, getting faster and faster, and thankfully they were going downhill by this point. And the howling got closer. And then, from the corner of his eye, Hamish caught sight of a blurred shape, something the size of a tree, moving just a couple of 100 yards off to one side. He couldn't quite see what it was, and he didn't want to waste time looking back when he should be looking forward and steering the dogs. And some of them began to whimper and to whine. Even Mungo, the lead dog, the oldest, the father of most of the pack there, started to whimper with distress, something he never normally did. And Hamish cracked the whip that they should go faster and faster and faster, and his wife called to him to go quicker, to go quicker. It was coming. The Wendigo is coming, she cried. And again, to the other side of him, as if it had darted round, some huge blurred shape moved through the trees, and the cracking of branches and the falling of snow. And just then, not only was the snow starting to fall from the branches of the trees, that thing, whatever it was, the Wendigo, whatever it was disturbing, but the wind began to whip up and the snows began to fall from the skies more heavily than they had been falling for the last few years, where just flakes here and flakes there, but suddenly it began to snow with a vengeance. And the dogs were racing as fast as they possibly could. They rounded this bend and that. Trees falling in the snow meant they had to detour this way, they had to detour that way. And at length they came to crest a ridge that took them down towards the town. They could see the town 1.5 miles, 2 miles distance on the other side of the Great Lake. And Hamish called to his wife, "The lake looks frozen. If we cut across the lake, we may get to the town quicker, but is the ice thick enough?" And she said to him, "Husband, it comes. I feel it. I can feel it coming. We must take the quickest route." And Hamish, calculating quickly in his mind, was sure that if they went across the ice, they could make that journey 10, 15 minutes quicker than if they went around on the banks of the Great Lake to get to the town. And the howling came again, snarling and something slobbering, getting closer and closer and closer. He could feel it yards away. And again the blur of movement behind him, something large with long limbs, getting quicker and quicker and faster and closer. The dogs whimpered, they and before he knew what was happening, the dogs had pulled down the slope, going faster and faster down that slope, down and down and down towards the great frozen lake. And suddenly they hit a rock and the sled tumbled, and he could hear his wife screaming. He could hear the dogs yelping as they rolled down and down and down and down and down the slope until they came into a great heap at the bottom, himself hurled from the sled and landing first in a deep snowdrift. Dragging himself to his feet as quickly as he could, breathless and in a degree of shock, blood dripping from the side of his head where he'd cracked it on some half-buried branch or stone in the snow, he looked round. He got the sled back upright. The dogs were getting themselves upright. And there he saw the shape of his wife lying in the snow. And he went and he picked her up. She was still breathing, his heart thudding with fear and panic, and hearing the sound of something. And he looked back momentarily and he saw something so large and so dark and so malformed coming towards him. It was almost like a tree tumbling down the slope, and he didn't want to waste a second longer staring at it in case it froze him with fear. He got his wife into the back of the sled, jeered at the dogs, and they were across the ice. And it wasn't as thick as it might be, but it took their weight. He could hear the ice beneath the sled cracking this side and that side, but they raced and they raced and they raced across the ice towards the settlement on the other side of the Great Lake. And the howling came again, and something more guttural, more roaring, more snarling. And momentarily glancing back, he could see the shape approaching across the ice itself. But the thing, whatever it was, Wendigo or some other beast he couldn't even begin to put a name to, was of such heaviness the ice beneath it began to crack, and it roared the louder, more furiously, more angrily. But as the creature broke into the thickness of the ice across the lake, the shattering of the ice began to spread out across the lake, spreading towards them. And he called upon the dogs. He cracked the whip as hard as he dare. He was not a cruel man to those dogs. He loved those dogs as much as he loved his wife. Well, almost as much as he loved his wife. But the fear in him, they had to go faster and faster and faster, and the dogs gave it their all. They hauled that sled as fast as they possibly could across the snows, until at length they came to the far bank, by which time citizens of the small settlement had come out to see what all of the roaring and the calling and the howling of the dogs was about, who was approaching in this dire weather, for the snows were still falling. And at length they came off the ice as it was cracking beneath them and water was sloshing over the runners of the sled. They got onto the land, and the hands of the people hauled Hamish off the front of the sled. They hauled his wife out the back of the sled. They brought them into town, and for a few minutes everything was a blur. Shapes and movements and noises and smells and the sense of heat as they were brought into the building. He didn't know whether he was coming or going until somebody propped him in a chair and started tipping brandy down his throat to warm him up. And coughing and spluttering, he finally got his wits together and calmed himself down. And people were talking to him, familiar faces he couldn't even put names to, but he knew the faces. He'd seen them on his previous trading trips. And he said, my wife, she's giving birth, she's in such pain, she needs help. And he was reassured by the men and women gathering around him that she was being tended to in another room, a much warmer room than the one he was currently in. The doctor had been sent for, the midwives had been sent for, she was being looked after. He need not worry about his wife. More brandy was tipped down him, and he was pushed closer to the small fire that was being banked up in what turned out to be the tavern, or one of the taverns in the town. And as the brandy flowed and his heart began to return to a normal pace, after an hour or so propped in front of the fire and feeling the warmth finally getting through to the bones of him, he had mind to say, is somebody looking after my dogs? The publican said, just drink your brandy. News will be coming soon about your wife. I'm sure of it. The doctors and the midwives are with her right now. And Hamish tried to describe to them the thing he had seen in the forests, the approaching Wendigo. And the people, the publican and the other people in the bar, they looked at him, and then they looked at each other, and he recognised the exchange of looks, that they clearly thought he was a little unhinged and that maybe the cold had got to his wits. It often happens. And just as he was starting to get a little irate at the way they were patronising him. The door opened, and in came the town doctor, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he said, "Hamish, you have a daughter, a fit, healthy daughter, and your wife, she will recover. She's not well. There have been problems, there have been complications, but she will recover. Rest assured of that. She's being well looked after." And there was much cheering and backslapping in the bar, and Hamish subsided back into the chair he had just hauled himself out of and drank the next brandy that was forced upon him. And said finally, when all of the congratulations and the backslapping had subsided, and he'd gone up and he'd seen his wife and he'd seen his child and he'd come back down again, and it was getting late into the evening, he said to the landlord, "My dogs, have they been fed? Have they been watered? I must go and tend them in case they have any injuries. The Wendigo came after us. We all fell and tumbled down the hillside. What happened, I do not know. How we managed to survive, but they pulled us to safety. I've got to present them with the biggest set of beef bones in the village as a reward for pulling us to safety in that way." And the publican said, "My friend, I don't know anything about the Wendigo. These Indian legends are strange to me. I don't understand any of that, but something has happened this night which I understand even less. Come with me." And he led the man out of the pub, wrapped up in the furs again, out into the backyard of the tavern. And there was the sled, broken and damaged and bits hanging off of it, and all of the rest things they'd packed in the back of the sled. Most of it left still out in the snows, but some of it still on the back of the sled. And the publican said, "I know how much you love your dogs, so it breaks my heart to do this, but you must see, because I don't understand it." And they took Hamish to a corner where there was a tarpaulin laid in the yard, and gently the publican pulled the tarpaulin off, and underneath were the 6 dogs, not woofing and barking and wagging their tails as they'd done on 1,000 prior occasions when Hamish had come to fuss them and feed them and tend to them, but still and dead and broken. And Hamish could see clearly with his own eyes that legs were bent at angles no dog's leg should ever be bent at, that necks were twisted and snapped, that those bodies were so damaged, so broken, that clearly they couldn't have survived the fall down the hillside. They could not have pulled him across the ice. They could not have pulled the sled across the ice the way they did. These are not dogs who had died of cold or of exhaustion. These were dogs who had died in the fall. Their injuries could have been achieved no other way. But dead they were, and many hours dead. But somehow, those loyal dogs, with old Mungo in the lead, had pulled them to safety, pulled them from the danger of the Wendigo. And whether or not the beast of the forest had existed, or was some delusion of cold, frightened minds, surely the magic was in the dogs, who even after death had managed to pull their master and mistress to safety. Thank you.